This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Parag Khanna. He's an international relations expert, best-selling author. He's a contributor to CNN. He's also a senior research fellow in the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Singapore, one of my favorite places to visit. I always enjoy going to Singapore. His new book that recently came across my desk, Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization. This is not light reading, but it's really great reading. If you have any curiosity for our connected geography, in 2016, how it all unfolds, Parag has really done the heavy lifting research. And as a guy who once was a political science major, who studied international relations in grad school, I really appreciate how far he has gone with his research, with his travel, to put together a story that really explains. The world is a really complicated place these days, and about one of the last places you will ever figure out how everything is really happening is turning on the TV. They are just about headlines and little factoids. If you want the deep dive, Parag has really hit the mark with Connectography. I hope you enjoy this conversation. What I love about where you're going, connectivity and geography. I had to write this down to make sure I didn't screw up the pronunciation. Connectography. It's so accurate. One of the things that I want to do in our conversation today, though, is to try and let you talk about this big picture view you have. Let us break it apart, because it is terribly difficult for people that don't travel to really see what you've put together clearly. Once you travel, it's like, oh, wow, this guy has done a lot of work. I see where he's going. But when you haven't had that travel experience, sometimes it's a little harder to digest what Dubai might be like or what Singapore might be like. So I want to kind of take that apart. But why don't you, from your perspective, that big elevator pitch, why you put this work together? Now, look, it's almost 500 pages. So your elevator pitch could go on for a couple days.
Michael, you should have seen the original manuscript. It was over 1,000 pages. Now, I hope that doesn't scare away everyone who's listening to us right now. Note to readers, it's been edited. It's only 500 pages long.
Talk about connectivity, though, because here we are. Look, you're in Singapore. I'm in Ho Chi Minh City today. And let me, one more big picture view after having gone through your work. I see, from my perspective, the things that you've laid out, the factual elements of where we are today, the supply chains, the politics, the geography, how it all connects together. I have a hard time imagining how anybody, left, right, communist, non-communist, I think most people are going to agree that's an accurate description. And to me, that's probably the most important point. There is, I think you will agree also, that there is the controversial element too, where you do have some prescriptive, where I'm sure there can be some people that say, hey, I love your prescription, and some people there's going to be some blowback. That's kind of my setup to let you jump in and tell me why you started to put this work together.
I would say that travelers like us are probably my most sort of loyal audience. People who, quote unquote, they just get it. And like you said, for anyone who's traveled, this is the way to capture all of the sentiments that we realize, all of the trends that we know are happening, even if it's hard to pinpoint them with data. And what I've tried to do in this book is in a non-controversial, non-ideological way. But like you point out, obviously they're controversial things, but to call it like I see it. And in traveling to just about every country in the world, I mean, I'm counting down the few places I haven't been to that I really want to go to, but I've thrown the whole kitchen sink of every continent in the world into this book to show how this concept of connectivity is more than just a lofty, ethereal notion of, oh yes, we all have mobile phones and you and I are talking on Skype. But there's a very concrete, physical, tangible evolution of connectivity according to three exact categories: transportation, energy, and communications. And when you lay it all down on the planet, literally, physically, and when you add it all up, it utterly overwhelms the notion that we have lived for the last couple of hundred years in a world of discrete states and nations and borders. This is the physical embodiment of globalization and how it completely transforms our human relationships, how it changes power dynamics. Instead of thinking about states and governments, we should be thinking about cities and infrastructures and supply chains, and how competition operates. We think of geopolitics as being reserved for those conversations about wars and armies and borders. And instead, geopolitics is the everyday reality of the tug of war over global value chains and value added in the world economy. And that's what this book is about. And there is not a single geography, not the Arctic, where I spent some shivering time, to, as you mentioned, Dubai and Singapore and the tropics, to the special economic zones of Africa, that is not put in this book, because every single place is not just ethereally connected, but physically connected. And that has just massive consequences. Just one last point is that this is a once in a 500-year thing. I'm a political scientist, or what maybe some would call a geopolitical economist. I think about the big picture trends, and this takes literally from the time when the medieval world became the modern world of states. We have not undergone such a systemic transformation. And there's a very rigorous term for this, very formal term in political science, that is systems change. And this is a book about systems change, and you and I are living through this moment that happens once every 500 years, where we move from one structure of a system to the next structure. And that's what's happening right now, and that's what this book is about.
So 3 years ago, I came to Asia for a speaking tour. I decided to stay after 3 or 4 months of this tour. And so I've spent probably 75% of my time, as I mentioned, in Asia in the last 3 years. And so I think what I want to dive into here is the cities part that you just mentioned, because I really relate to that. When I look at the world now, when I feel the world in my mind, I say to myself, okay, let me compare in my mind really quickly Los Angeles, San Diego, Tokyo, Beijing, Hong Kong, Ho Chi Minh City, Singapore, Dubai, London. And really quickly in my head, I think about the pros and cons of each city. I'm not necessarily worried about whether or not that government is a benevolent dictator, a democracy, a communist government. I'm not really thinking about that. I'm thinking about, how am I going to live in that city? And I think that's a lot where you're getting people to think about in your work.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head, but you also said two very sophisticated things at the same time, so I want to split them up. The first is the city versus the state. Absolutely. You are thinking about, what is your quality of life? What is the livability metric or score of that city? Because you know that cities actually, other than in totally third world, fourth world places that are falling apart, tend to be the islands of stability. And that's how I refer to them. Cities, the islands of stability. There is not a single successful state or society on the planet Earth that is not built upon a stable, a politically and commercially and economically stable city. We have had cities as our fundamental, tangible, political unit for 5,000 years. We've only had modern nations for a couple of hundred years. You tell me which is going to last longer. The answer is, of course, the city. And we have more large megacities and more livable cities, more economically viable and stable cities than ever before. And so when you are traveling around the world, you're not comparing America and England and Germany. You're comparing Los Angeles and London and Berlin. And that's what's happening to all of us as we become an urban species. So that's fundamentally what's going on. And that's why, as economists, as market forecasters, when you're trying to understand what are the growth markets of the future, you can't just generalize about India as a whole or China as a whole. We haven't had, at any point in history, countries that have more than 1 billion people in them. You have to look a bit more granularly at the provinces and cities that are performing well and those that are not, because every country is so highly unequal, and the city is always the driver and the locus of growth. And then there's your point about regimes. And of course, mayors and cities are a big part of the story of this book. And one of the things I pointed out in some of my other articles, and you probably saw my TED Talk from a few weeks ago, pointing out that mayors are the ones who now have the most credibility. Proverbially speaking, they're the ones who have taken out the trash. They know how to run a society, whereas elected representative politicians tend to have very little governance experience. They don't know a lot about budgets and so forth. And so mayors have an enormous amount of credibility, and more mayors are now sitting presidents or heads of state of countries than ever in history as a result of this credibility that they've built up from running very large cities, which in many cases have populations way larger than many countries. And of course, mayors call themselves CEOs, managers. They don't think in terms of how, democratically done was this, and was it done according to this procedure or that procedure. They're thinking, did it get done? Am I utilitarian? Did I improve the net welfare of the people within my jurisdiction? And more citizens around the world, no matter what kind of state or polity or political system you live in, are saying, that's what I want. That's what I want my leader to be.
I think about the idealism, especially as an American growing up. We have the idealism about our particular style of government. But as I get older and I travel and I see other forms of government, I come down to the granular level and I say, how am I living? I mean, I could argue for the rest of my life about the potential hypothetical of the big picture, but then on the base level, it often looks very similar. And I think one of the big pictures that you bring into this discussion about why big cities are frankly starting to have a competitive spirit and bring similar things to the table. Open up the discussion on what you refer to as the tight supply chain partnerships, supply chain in general, because this world is connected in such a way. I mean, the connection is what allows me as an American to say, you know what? I feel 100% comfortable in Singapore. Man, you know what? I actually feel even more comfortable when I go into the department store, Isetan in Tokyo, and see their food court, because they don't have that in America. And this supply chain thought process is really, this is something for today. This is not something we've ever experienced in humanity before.
Right. And again, the foundations of global connectivity enable this transformation towards what I call the supply chain world, in which anything can reach anyone, anywhere, to put it in the most colloquial possible way. And cities are, of course, where you most efficiently have the supply chain come together, where you have, the lowest barriers to entry, the fastest kind of, customs procedures, the best grocery stores that are stocking the diverse products from around the world. There was a data point I was looking for in my research that I wasn't able to get a consensus from, but that is the number of SKUs, right? Stock keeping units. So we used to live in a world a half century ago with a very finite number of stock keeping units. And now, of course, it's practically infinite. So the diversity of products that we have and the complex assembly of those products is truly global. I have maps and diagrams, which you've seen in this book, that point out that from industry to industry, whether it's pharmaceuticals or automotive or electronics, the geographic complexity of the production of those products. So, for example, the digital design coming from Silicon Valley, the manufacturing engineering from Germany, the assembling in Asia, the marketing and sales in the Middle East, the after-service call center somewhere else. All of this is the supply chain ecosystem for a single product. And there's hardly an area where that supply chain is not global. And yet, what accounts for success or failure in the global economy today is the extent to which a country or a city or a special economic zone can assemble within its own territory the highest value-added kind of factors of production in order to pay its workers the most, in order to retain those sectors and those jobs from being offshore to other places. Because when you live in a world of total infrastructural connectivity and huge amounts of investment going into high-tech special economic zones and corridors and so forth, it's a world of total investment fungibility. So you can pick up stakes, a company or an investor can pick up stakes one week and move, the next week to somewhere else. We used to, as you very well know, not live in that world. When Walmart or another company would go into China, build a factory, that was a huge capex, and say, oh my God, we're going to be here for 30, 40 years. Now, suddenly, Vietnam and Malaysia and Thailand and Indonesia and the Philippines and even Africa are offering competitive sites of production. So companies are saying, hey, I can offshore pretty quickly. This investment in, the urban quality of life and having a skilled workforce and having good quality infrastructure is a totally global competition. And of course, the world economy used to be dominated by, to 80% by just the OECD countries. And that's not the way the world is anymore. And you and I live in a couple of those countries, and the last couple of decades have really proved how the combination of infrastructure investment and connecting through supply chains to global markets makes you a real player.
So I want to take something from the headlines right now, which is Apple Computer, and specifically Apple Computer and taxes. And if people see the headlines, then look, there's a big connection with Apple and Ireland. And essentially, Apple has a massive amount of their money parked outside of the U.S. For those people that don't pay attention, look, the U.S. has one of the highest corporate tax rates. So there's a huge negative incentive in dealing with the U.S. government on corporate taxes. But it's an interesting thing because here we have a situation where a lot of people, and this is where it gets kind of political, and big picture, I see and you see where it should all go, but it's interesting how many different hands are in the cookie jar. So what in the world is the reason? Why does an Apple computer, which generally probably has a lot of top employees that are fairly progressive in their thinking, probably many of their employees support the ideas of even a Bernie Sanders perhaps, but then they need to, from a business perspective, to compete. And to compete, they're working with Ireland to keep their investment monies outside of the country. This starts to get really complicated. And I think what I'm really getting at, and there's a lot of different ways we can describe it, is just one example of friction.
Right. And I want to go back to your example of Apple as representative of the broader phenomenon of what I call the stateless superpowers. And in the supply chain world, you move away from thinking about just countries as the main units of power and authority, but rather anyone who can master the supply chain. And there used to be just a few companies that we would think of as being so seamlessly global and able to maximize their arbitrage around various geographies. Think obviously of commodities traders that had not much of a physical presence, but their ability to move goods around difficult geographies and get them to market and be market makers was the source of their revenues. Now we have stateless superpowers across the private sector. We have, of course, the traditional commodities firms, but of course, consulting firms and hedge funds, those are, of course, the financial services industry more broadly, consulting and professional services. Where is McKinsey? Where is Accenture? Where are they? The answer is they're everywhere. Where is DHL, right? And now technology enters this. And of course, it would be ironic if it didn't, because technology, is part of what liquefies and greases the supply chain world, of course. It's the cloud. And more technology companies are saying, wait a minute, we can operate in the cloud. Our coders, our programmers, the distribution of what we create is everywhere. Not only the physical goods for a company like Apple that obviously makes so much of its hardware in China and other places, but also software, because, most software is now being produced for cloud applications. So Silicon Valley companies are saying, yes, we benefited from the nurturing environment, the well-regulated American jurisdiction, the talent, the knowledge, the support of the government over the last 50 years. But our market is absolutely everywhere. We're selling more product, again, whether it's software or hardware, around the world than we are within the United States. So we need to have sales, positions abroad. We need to invest in talent abroad. We need to be marketing abroad. We need to be faster to market abroad because we're competing against HTC and Lenovo and all of these other, Samsung, all these Asian players. And we have to retain, because of what the American tax code is, as much profit abroad as possible to reinvest in these new operations. Otherwise, we're not going to be a high growth company and, deliver returns to investors. So all of these things, like you said, it's complicated. It's more than complicated. Yeah. It's complex.
Yeah.
It's not just complicated, it's complex. And that's why companies are doing all of these things, not because they're un-American or anti-American. Unfortunately, in the American political debate, we have a disastrously unsophisticated conversation about the relationship between supply chains, investment, trade, and jobs, right? We don't appreciate that when American firms invest abroad, create jobs abroad, increase their sales abroad, and so forth, they're not only creating some revenues for the company, back for the parent company at home to invest in higher end jobs and R&D and so forth at home, but they're also helping to develop and nurture the overseas markets that are a large and growing share of their bottom line. This is so much more complicated than a push and pull between a few manufacturing jobs. And I'm very worried, of course, about the American political debate, not understanding the intricate relationship between these factors.
Let me dig a little bit deeper on the tax example, just so we kind of can flesh it out some. When I look at the Apple situation, I say to my head, okay, obviously the powers that be in the political realm are not necessarily thinking this through carefully. However, they have constituents that vote for them, and politicians just want to stay in power. But when I look at the Apple tax situation, I say it could be one of two things. Either government is saying this needs to be a punitive tax, so we're going to keep it higher than other countries, or we're keeping the tax higher because, frankly, we just need that revenue. In my mind, I have a hard time believing that they really need it. It feels more punitive. And I think that is one of the big things that as Americans, there's a lot of great things Americans do, but I think that's one of the things that we sometimes get wrong. And you just described with this global outlook that if you are thinking very narrowly, only on your home turf, and so we're going to put a punitive penalty on our best companies, that's just short-sighted.
It is disastrously counterproductive, and you and I can see very well the blatant logic that's going into the various iterations of legislation that are in Congress attempting to impose these one-time either punitive taxes or, on the other hand, amnesties. They're still thinking in terms of territorial taxation and their ability to capture and to ground, to physically, geographically ground companies in a supply chain world. It's not going to work. The Congress will lose the cat and mouse game. Everyone is playing this game. Here's what they're missing, and you and I both know this to be true, and the data backs this up. You shouldn't be chasing tax. You should be chasing investment. Investment is still stickier, right? You can do one-off punitive taxes and amnesties, and that money is going to come and it's going to burn up in exactly 4 seconds of debt obligations, right, being paid. You want to have long-term benefits to your society, whether you're a rich country like America or you're a poor country or developing country in Asia. You've got to be chasing the longer-term investment that brings in technology, that creates jobs, that improves quality of life, not just one-off taxes, through a percentage point, increase here and there over your competitors. And that's something that, again, the U.S. government is just not understanding well at all.
Look, the top corporate entities are always going to have more brain power to delegate or to put on a project than the government entities. They're never going to be able to compete. I don't think.
It's not just about whether it's an unfair fight in terms of who's sitting at the negotiating table. It's also about the long-term logic of understanding the system that we live in, that everyone has been part of creating. Both governments and corporations created this supply chain world, not just one versus the other. It's a question of who has a better understanding of where the complex aggregate kind of system is going and how to play within it. And I think that there is a win-win, right? And you and I both know what that is, because the United States is still a very attractive investment destination. It still is one of always the 2 largest countries in the world receiving foreign investment, and rightly so, and deserves to be, and should continue to be. In order to do so, we have to actually not be focusing nearly as much on the tax debate. And, some of the candidates are being fairly clear about the need for transparency around a simplified corporate tax code and personal tax code for that matter. And saying we need to be attracting investment across all different sectors, across industry, real estate, telecommunications, technology, manufacturing, across the board. And that's what's going to create higher wages and higher jobs. And that can be totally win-win. The United States could easily outplay the rest of the world. All of these smaller jurisdictions that are offshoring capital and holding capital abroad. The U.S. could one swoop of the pen easily defeat its competitors, who are also its allies, of course. Our biggest allies geopolitically are also always our biggest competitors economically, right? We're not competing with China for the lowest wage manufacturing jobs, right? We're competing with our Western counterparts and allies for corporate domicile, right? That's what's going on. And we can win that very easily. America can win that very easily if it were to just get its politics together.
Let me talk about China for a moment. I'm going to come back to American politics and some of the real topical stuff, specifically borders, which I think is a really interesting discussion. But I want to go into China for a moment. And it's hard for people to not travel to mainland China to have a perspective, because it's just massive. The success is just huge. I mean, look, a real simple idea. You walk down the streets of Beijing, you see guys playing pickup basketball. Hey, guess what, America? They ain't 5'6". I'm seeing 6'3" and 6'4" guys playing basketball. Okay. So, there's a lot of wealth. It's right there with America. What I think is interesting about China, and this goes right into the heart of some of your work, infrastructure, and specifically China helping with infrastructure all around the world. I mean, China has clearly a global plan to help developing countries boost their infrastructure. And what's interesting about what China is doing, and I want you to open this up, they're not necessarily exporting their money and their ideas on how to help a country with infrastructure. They're not necessarily exporting their government ideals. They're not exporting their military. They're basically exporting their money and their expertise, and they're building these supply chains and building this trust by helping these other countries. Of course, it's going to be win-win for China. Maybe it's very different than we've seen in the last 50, 60 years. China's operating in an entirely new style of building supply chain, aren't they?
Absolutely. And again, you have captured there in just a couple sentences the last 35 years of global capital circulation and the geopolitics of it in ways that the American conversation usually stops at, they've got trade surpluses, they're building currency reserves, they're evil. If you extend what's actually happening one step further, hold on, that capital is being massively recycled into emerging market commodities and infrastructure, right? And that's actually very good for the world. I've been traveling in these countries for 20 years and writing books about it for 10 years. And what I found is that the best thing that ever happened to the second world and the third world is the rise of China and India and their consumption of commodities and their investment, of course, in their provision of lower cost infrastructure for other emerging markets so that those frontier economies can get on their feet. That's the full picture of the complex flows of capital in and out of the West to Asia and then outbound to Africa and the Middle East. And that's a great thing for global development. And you're right, China doesn't really export ideology, it doesn't export communism, it doesn't export its system of government. It simply exports infrastructure in order to smooth the flows of goods out of those countries and to accelerate its own exports into those countries. So when you see Chinese mobile phones dumped onto foreign markets, from Peru to Angola, that's not only that's the part of the flip side of them having built the railways and the airports and all of the other infrastructure that allows them to get the commodities out of those countries, but to ship their stuff out to those countries. And not surprisingly, particularly in the last decade, the largest share of global trade growth has been across emerging countries and across developing markets, specifically the greater Indian Ocean region of Africa, Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Far East, right? These regions, this greater Indian Ocean represents the vast majority of the entire world's population and almost all of the growth in world trade. Obviously, the U.S.-Canada relationship and the transatlantic relationship and the trans-Pacific relationship is a large chunk of world trade. But most of the growth in world trade is happening across the emerging markets of the greater Indian Ocean region. And that is because of this Chinese, outbound capital and infrastructure development. And what I call this is the new global public good. We tend to think as Americans as security as the most paramount global public good. And since World War II, the United States is the foremost trusted provider of a global security provision. We stabilize regions. We have networks of alliances. We are an offshore balancer against aggression, all of these things. That is true to a large extent. There's lots of debates about whether or not we're doing a good job in that, and that's a separate issue, obviously. I've written a lot about that. But the point is that it's not the only global public good in the global sort of system. Countries want infrastructure. Most of the world's population lives in countries that were born in our parents' lifetimes, right? Since World War II, since the end of colonialism, there were only 50 countries then, there's 200 today. These countries need infrastructure. And if America is the leading provider of security, China is the leading provider of infrastructure. China is welcome around the world. There's a backlash. I've written a lot and tracked the backlash from Zambia to Mongolia to Kazakhstan to Myanmar. But by and large, countries need this infrastructure. They can't build it themselves. China does it fast. It does it cheap. It does it efficiently. And it gets these countries connected to global supply chains. So it is, in fact, win-win.
It's interesting, though, you mentioned that about, you mentioned Myanmar, and I see it in Vietnam as well, too, where the business relationships are so important with China. But on the ground, there is a hesitation with the people. People outside of China seem to, especially ones that have not been there, and perhaps even countries that touch a border with China, have some hesitation. There's a trust element there. There's a trust concern amongst the average everyday people, not just people in America, but, it could be other Southeast Asian countries, not necessarily trusting the motivations, even though their economies are so linked and their standard of living has been rising for decades because of that connection with China.
Absolutely. So whether it's the trade integration between China and the rest of the world, and by the way, I should have mentioned earlier, China is the top trade partner of 124 countries in the world, and the U.S. is the top trade partner of 56 countries in the world. I have a very snazzy spaghetti bowl looking map of this in the book, which you've seen. But just within Asia, there is a lot of benefits to regional trade integration. The volume of intra-Asian trade has grown drastically in the last decade and a half, since the last 2 decades, really, since the Asian financial crisis. And particularly since the most recent global financial crisis, having more intra-Asian trade has helped Vietnam, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, all the countries in this region remain fairly robust and resilient in their growth because they've been less dependent on exports to the U.S. and Europe than they used to be. So everyone has benefited from this. But now there is a lot of suspicion, as you pointed out. And this is not just the individual or social level, but it's also definitely the government level. Because of China's, military expansionism and its usage of infrastructure as almost a military strategic tool in the South China Sea, building islands and so forth, basically muscling around, it has permanently raised the suspicions of every single one of its neighbors. And China has more neighbors than any country in the entire world, right? China has 14 neighbors, and then it has maritime neighbors. None of them trust China. Let's be perfectly clear. There is no rose-tinted goggles around this. You and I travel to every single country that is around China, and no country will ever trust China ever again. That's not the question. The question is, they have to deal with it because they neighbor China. So whether or not you trust your neighbor doesn't matter. He's still your neighbor. You can't force him out. And China plays the long game. So take Myanmar. Of course, Myanmar has gone through a political, upheaval in the last, decade in particular. And Aung San Suu Kyi's party effectively, runs at least, some parts of the government today. And she's obviously pro-Western. Does that change the fact that the country borders China, that most of its foreign investment comes from China, that most of its exports, which are of course basic goods and commodities, come or go to China? None of those things change. And until you, as a Western country, intervene in the supply chain and diminish that country's dependency, whether that country is Mongolia or Kazakhstan or Myanmar or Sri Lanka, unless you diminish that country's dependency on China, you're not really changing the geopolitical equation, even if all the people in the country have a visceral hatred and mistrust of China. And we've just seen this play out in Sri Lanka with their election. A couple of years ago already, a new government came in and on the platform, literally on the campaign platform of saying that the Rajapaksa government had been selling out to China and giving all these fancy port projects and so forth to China, and the country was becoming heavily indebted to China, and that things would change. And of course, a year and a half later, here we are, and all of those projects are continuing because who else is going to do them? And this is what I simply call putting your money where your mouth is. If Western countries want to compete geopolitically and geoeconomically with China, then you have to put your money where your mouth is. You have to substitute for that capital that is coming in from China and those exports that are going to China. Otherwise, you're not actually altering the strategic calculus that those countries have to make every day. Whether or not they like China, they're stuck with it.
Let me go into borders. Borders is a hot topic right now, whether it's Europe with refugees coming from Syria, Afghanistan, etc., whether it's America and our southern border debate. It's a discussion that we can't get away from today. I look at borders and I think to myself, well, when I travel with an American passport, there's no better feeling than just showing up at a country, no visa needed, they let me in. They trust me. They trust me to come on in. Every time I have to get a visa, I always have a little hesitation in the back of my head. Am I going to jail? Is something going to happen here? The red light alert, lights up a little bit more, even if it's unfounded. And now once you go through the experience of getting a visa, you then realize, well, it's mostly bureaucracy and there's nothing to be afraid of, etc. But when I think of borders, And I think about everyone's views of borders, those looking to cross a border or those that are inside the border. I see there's fear. I see, number one, the people inside the border, what are the fears they have? I see, well, I don't want to pay for the new people. Perhaps, I feel like if new people come in, I have to pay for welfare programs. That's coming out of my pocket. That's one of the fears. I see also, for example, and this would be in Europe and America, we don't want to let the bad people in, whoever the bad people might be. And of course, look, if somebody's a known ISIS fighter, nobody wants to let them in and no one really cares. Keep them out. And then there's also the issue of people inside the border, maybe they just don't want to share. They don't want to share the good fortune. But there is something to be said, again, as I make that kind of initial thought of me as an American with a passport and I go to a country and I can come in easily. If trust is there and the people inside don't feel threatened, then to me, it makes perfect sense. And it's so good for everyone that there can be this kind of transparent moving across borders. But those three things that I just talked about, the not sharing, the fear of bad guys, and the fear of paying for other people, those fears, whether rational or not rational, whether somewhat true or not true at all, that really gets to the crux of the matter.
Rather than, leveraging the simple fact that no country in the history of the world has more benefited from being open and welcoming and sharing, its geography with immigrants than America, and that continues to be the case. And so we need to always bear that in mind, of course, right? I've done so much work and research on this issue for this book and in some of the recent columns that I've done that are pointing out that especially as America is aging, right, that's past the sort of median age of maximum consumption in which populations move towards saving for retirement and so forth, you need immigrants. You need young people who are part of the workforce, who are paying taxes, who are contributing to society. And nativists, if you will, for lack of a better term, don't really appreciate that. And the data certainly points against their line of reasoning. So I think it's very unfortunate that we're having these emotionally driven conversations rather than looking at the data. European countries know in even more extreme way just how rapidly they are aging and how much they need immigrants in their workforce. We have a lot of data on how, in fact, immigrants aren't even competing for the same degree of jobs. And we also know that the counter argument in the U.S. is not valid. That argument being, if only we had less immigrants, then wages would rise for certain jobs and Americans would take them. That's also not true because of the geographic distribution of where those Americans are and what their skills are and so forth. I have very little patience, as you can probably tell, for the kind of argumentation that is about them stealing from us when the data shows that, immigrants are honest by and large, they're paying taxes, they're very supportive of they're net contributors, not just net takers from the system. So it's very aggravating, and of course it's getting more incensed, whether right now in the debate, whether it's Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, or whether it's, of course, the far-right groups in Europe. And I obviously, what I can appreciate is the sort of, cultural inhibitions that people have about foreigners coming in who don't speak the native language of the country and these kinds of assimilation issues. My response to that is make a greater effort on assimilation, rather than throwing out the very economic lifeblood of your future. And I don't see nearly enough honest conversation about that as I would like to. It's most honest in Germany, which is, of course, doing the most to bring in and to sort of, welcome immigrants. I've spent a lot of time in Germany over the last 25 years and went to high school there, so I have a lot of, sort of insight into what's going on. But I don't see that honest conversation in other countries nearly as much as I would like to.
Let me talk about losing jobs for a moment. And for example, America. So we have this interesting situation in America where Walmart has become this operation that gives so many people in America so much of what they want. But Walmart also, and specifically how they produce their products, they found it's cheaper to go to China and Vietnam and have their products produced there. Somewhere in America, we've gotten kind of lost in this idea of, okay, all of our manufacturing jobs, not all, but a lot of them left. And, you can't They left because it was cheaper. I mean, everyone at their heart doesn't want to spend more money. Even the guy on the street in America that wants the manufacturing job, he understands conceptually, oh, if they'll do it cheaper, then somehow this has all become evil. Whereas the cheaper jobs in China that allow the products to be produced have given you more value for your money at Walmart.
Bingo. That's very true. And again, I only wish that people would think about the sort of full cycle accounting of all of this. Jobs that are lower wage go offshore to other countries and products come back that are cheaper so that, more Americans can afford to enjoy these things at a lower price. If you have a utilitarian bone in your body, or fiber in your hair, that thinks about the greatest good and welfare for the greatest number, you would support this, actually. And you would make a distinction, this goes back to the very first issue we were talking about today, you would make a distinction between that which is occurring because of globalization and that which needs to be done on a political level. People talk about globalization as if it is the governor of each society and that it is doing us wrong. It is not. It is politicians, politics, governments, and lack of leadership that is doing us wrong. There are many ways to cope with the situation of jobs in a particular skill or unskilled category or being offshored, such as taking all of the money that we do have, the tax base that we do have, the investment capability that we do have, and retraining workers, helping them transition to new sectors of the economy that are high wage. All of these kinds of things. The fact that we don't do them is the fault of policy and politics. You don't blame globalization for that. You do, in fact, blame Washington and governors and representatives and politics. And that's the real problem here. John Edwards was talking about the need to retrain workers, who were losing jobs to China back in the 2004 U.S. election. So that's like more than a decade ago. Where is the national reskilling program in America today, like more than a decade after that was identified as a hot button issue in American presidential politics? It's not there. And I don't blame globalization for America's inability to do that because, I study countries that do this right. I look at Germany, at South Korea, at Singapore, at Switzerland, the countries that actually invest in training their workers to occupy higher rungs of the value chain. And that's what America should do as well.
My simple online business, which was started in 1996, I had clients in over 70 countries by the year 2000. So anything about globalization for me has always been, this is so exciting. So anyone that says globalization is a negative, you're right. It's the politics that can be a negative, but globalization itself, my God, that's the greatest opportunity to get rich that there's ever been seen in the history of mankind.
Yep. and not only that, it is this greatest opportunity. Again, it's the greatest good for the greatest number. If you think about the world population getting connected to global markets and supply chains, and we just don't use, we don't have the right data. So we've got prominent scholars today, who are denouncing the lack of productivity growth in the United States. You've got Robert Gordon and his new book. And then I remember hearing Hal Varian recently, the chief economist of Google, saying, I don't pay any attention to this kind of data that uses the exactly 10 million people who still work in the manufacturing workforce as the measure or, the bedrock of data and analysis on labor productivity, because we're not taking into account all of the cost savings from technology and our welfare improvements. Because we have bad data and bad methodology, suddenly we badmouth globalization. I don't think that that's a really good way to think about these things.
Let me go into infrastructure for a moment and specifically how new infrastructure happens around the world. As a traveler, you've traveled a lot more than me. What's really interesting is the countries, and we as Americans, we can come up with excuses for this, but we as Americans, our infrastructure is dilapidated by comparison to, for example, the new work that I see across China. It could be Vietnam, Singapore, Dubai. What I really find interesting is that benevolent dictators, however one wants to define them, it seems like that there's been I don't know if this is just good fortune of good leaders, whether we're looking in Dubai or Singapore. And now look, in America, they might say, well, hold on, but I heard in the news, you don't have the right to do this in Singapore. You don't have the right to do this in Dubai. You know what? On the margins, you could be 100% correct. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is building roads, building buildings, building trains. And somehow or another, some of these countries that are not the quote pure democracies of America are getting so much more done.
And this is what I call very bluntly in the book, or what I describe as, our misplaced framing of the global competitive dynamic today. We think about victory versus defeat as who has a democratic system versus an authoritarian system, right? Or capitalist versus communist. The truth is that winners and losers in the 21st century will be determined by old versus new, not any of these ideological things. Who has newer and better stuff and is able to maximize the utility of that stuff to improve the welfare of their population. And of course, you and I live in emerging markets who are building brand new stuff, newer high-speed railways, newer factories, latest technologies, leapfrogging, if you will, higher fixed capital formation, and so on and so on. And that's what we're seeing playing out today, is new versus old. Of course, there's these incredibly valuable, important, soft, and intangible factors around education, innovation, creativity, knowledge society. I wouldn't, as an American, growing up in America like you, doubt for a minute that is an ultimate source of human and societal strength and resilience and capacity, without a doubt. However, if you only believe in that, you are underestimating just how quickly American inventions, American know-how, American technology, American knowledge are flowing rapidly across borders in this globalized supply chain world to others who are rapidly implementing and executing on those ideas using, Cisco and IBM and our universities that have foreign campuses to train the people to harness the latest technologies to build very competitive economies. And that's what's happening today. America is an incredibly benevolent provider, not only of capital and of technology, and now also of cheap oil and gas to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is taking advantage of it.
What's really interesting about infrastructure development in America, it really comes down to the very local level, and it's all about not in my backyard. And that idea of not in my backyard has literally across the country, except for in kind of brand new areas, has literally stopped almost all infrastructure development. It's almost like only when the bridge falls down do we do something new. And look, I'm an American. I'm not trying to be like, hey, I'm currently outside of America. I'm offering this crazy criticism. But you know what? I'm an honest guy. And when I see a brand new gleaming city like Singapore, and I compare it to an older city in America, I say, hold on, we keep saying that we are the best and the brightest and we do the newest and greatest, but it's just not factually correct. And I would love for you to take apart a city that I've been to for a period of time, so I have some perspective on it. I think you have lived there, I believe, or maybe grew up there some, which is Dubai. And Dubai is there's a lot of interesting things going on in Dubai. I have my feeling about Dubai right now. I'm sure if I went back, it was about 2 years ago, I think if I went back today, it would probably feel a little bit different. It probably will keep changing like a lot of emerging places keep changing. Why don't you talk about Dubai, though? Because Dubai is right at the forefront of so many of these issues that we're talking about. The mega city, tight supply chain. It's also become a center of, like, from Dubai, you could pretty much fly just about anywhere in the world nonstop.
Yep. So Dubai is a real archetype for the thesis of connectography. And I have a long chapter just on the city in the book. And the reason is that it has, for its entire history, for thousands of years, it has physically sat at what you might call the center of the world, the crossroads of major continents, right? Europe, Africa, Asia. But connectivity is how it took advantage of that geography. And I did, in fact, spend my childhood living there, and I talk about that in the book. But of course, it was a almost insignificant place at the time because it was not connected. We only care about places when they are connected. And Dubai made itself the single most physically connected city in the entire world over precisely my lifetime, because it was a backwater when I was there. And so now, how did it get to be that way? I mean, the answer is that physical, raw, infrastructural, those linkages that make it really, again, take advantage of its geography. So yes, now you can fly on Emirates to any major city in the entire world. They're about to start Auckland, New Zealand, for example. You can, of course, it's a 24/7 supply chain transshipment hub. So you've got the shipping and logistics and transshipment, all of those things are going on there. Now it's also managed a pretty substantial economic transformation. It never had a lot of oil. Abu Dhabi controls most of the oil across, of the 7 Emirates. And so it rapidly became a hub for finance, for real estate, for hospitality, services, all of these other things. So the economy can definitely withstand the current meltdown in global commodities prices and looks to do that. And it does so, of course, by being open and welcoming to immigrants. Getting back to the things that you and I have just been talking about, it is the world, the true world's melting pot. It is the single most diverse city on the planet Earth. It is more so than New York. It has more nationalities, and of course, it has 90% of its population being non-nationals, being non-Emiratis. Emiratis are less than 10% of the population of the entire country, and even less so probably of the city of Dubai, which is the fastest growing city in the entire world. You know, its population is growing by more than 1 million people every 5, 6, 7 years, and they have plans to expand, you know, to this limitless desert space with more and more infrastructure development. And they have no problems about doing it. Their only obstacle is the pace at which they can build and desalinate water and build, you know, sewage systems and so forth. That is the incredible ambition. So in a few years from now, it will be larger demographically than Singapore is. It won't be as large an economy. The Middle East economies still rank in the billions, not in the trillions, right? Asia is trillions and trillions of dollars. The Middle East is just billions. But as a city, it is definitely a true, genuine global city. In fact, you know, McKinsey and all these others do rank and measure what's called, sort of flow intensity of urban economies. And Dubai is the newest member of the global cities list, which includes only, you used to be able to count it on one hand, exactly, New York, London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And now you've got 6 cities, and Dubai is the 6th. And so it's really taken advantage of its geography. And of course, if you went there today again, even after just a couple of years, you'd get lost because the roads have changed. There's new routes to get from A to B. But it is that willingness to invest in the physical dimensions of the place, to master plan it, not to let the city just be accidentally, organically growing, but to physically master plan its growth over a long time scale, and to attract people from all over the world in all different sectors. You have a special economic zone for every conceivable activity so that it's better regulated, welcoming to foreign investors, and building kind of an ecosystem between education, industry, and trade linkages and so forth. So they're really thinking strategically about everything that's going on there.
Okay, you just laid out a lot of positives, and I laid out some positives. My feeling being in Dubai, I felt like, wow, okay, this reminds me of Vegas in many ways. I mean, it is in the desert and a lot of new buildings, so it kind of feels on the ground. It felt a lot like Vegas to me. Just a very, very new, everything new. And the culture doesn't necessarily feel like it's there. It's pure money and capitalism. And I'm not so sure, for example, even if it might be the biggest and best city of the future, I'm not so sure I want that heat all the time. But that's not really the point, is it? The point isn't whether these negative things might possibly exist from one's perspective. That's not the point.
No, it's not. You know, it's so you have to have kind of like a to each his own sort of attitude. The fact is that people are voting with their feet. And if clearly millions of people are moving there, there must be something about it that they like. It's not only a place that represents a huge quantum leap in quality of life for people from India and Pakistan and Africa. So it goes without saying that it attracts people from developing countries. But the British population of Dubai has doubled in the last 5 years to nearly 300,000 people. So there's plenty of Westerners who are deciding that that is going to be their permanent home as well. You can have your gripes about your weather. You can say it's, and it's like Las Vegas. But again, it's a supply and demand world. And clearly there's a huge demand to go and live there. That a city of Dubai's size and ranking as a connected city is home to hundreds of thousands of actually, interesting people who are on the move and doing very cool things. The purpose of Dubai is not to be the next London. It's not to be the next New York. It's not to be the next, Paris. It's not to replicate the pathway and the ideals of those cities and the sense of place that those cities provide and have provided, that sort of emotional geographic sanctuary. That is not why Dubai exists. Dubai's purpose is to make you feel like you can be anywhere, not just like you are in that one place that has thousands of years of history. It's a different kind of place. So you cannot judge it by whether or not it has 6 Louvre museums or a Tate Modern. You have to judge it by whether or not it provides that added level of security and stability and connectedness that millions of people around the world have lacked for their lives, their entire lives, depending on where they came from.
That was a great point that you made in your book too. And I'm wise enough to know, and I didn't make it in my lead up there, but when I left, I said, well, gosh, it's the evolution. What will happen next? And I had a friend of mine recently say, hey, I'm not going to come to visit Vietnam because a friend of mine went there and was there one day, didn't like it and left. And so I'm not going to take my family there for vacation now because, so it's the same point you're making back to me. And I don't want the audience to think that I was being that narrow-minded, but it was a kind of a snapshot feeling that I had. As we're talking about a mega city like Dubai, and look, America has a few. I mean, New York's the biggest, and we're seeing these other big mega cities develop around the world. It leaves people, especially when I think of America, it leaves people in the smaller country kind of areas, the Rust Belt. It leaves a lot of people on the outside looking in. I don't know what to say to people exactly, but, and my girlfriend says, I don't like the cities as much. And this kind of gets to your book again. It's not necessarily whether you like it or not. It's what are we doing as a species? Where are we going? And if you want to compete today, I don't know how you can compete in a small one stoplight town in America. You can because of the internet, of course. You could run your online business, and I know people that do this. You could absolutely be anywhere you want in the world. However, as you just made the point about Dubai and interacting with people, if you want to find yourself with the greatest probability, of chance of opportunity to meet those interesting people and further yourself, I don't know how you can argue against the mega cities. It's not necessarily, it's just where we are going. Why don't you talk about some of that conflict that people have of like, hey, my Rust Belt, that's where I am, that's where my family is. And, I don't want to necessarily be in this city. We see this debate and conflict all the time.
Well, I want to say that Americans are very lucky that they live in a great, big, broad, rich, diverse, resource-rich and geographically disparate, civilization and geography. The history of America is the history of people migrating and moving in search of opportunity. Just think of, the Louisiana Purchase and the Gold Rush and the Western Railroads and so on. Only in America do you have such a great and vast civilization with so many cities that the population can constantly sort and resort into as economic dynamics change and as certain industries rise and fall. And America is going through another one of these great resortings today as people move from, the north to the south and the east to the west and so forth in search of new opportunities after the financial crisis. So I want to say that first and foremost is an extraordinarily important source of resilience for America. Within that context, if you are a Rust Belt auto worker and you're tied to, Flint, Michigan or somewhere, around Detroit, you don't see the industry coming back, the jobs coming back. You have that opportunity in America to move. You may not want to, but there is this gravity of the large cities, whether it's Chicago or LA or Dallas, the mega cities of America, that is attracting people and allowing them to get a new start. And other people do not have that good fortune. Really only Americans do. China is trying to become a country where if you are displaced in one factory job in one town, you can get on a high-speed railway and move to a big city and find a job. That's a noble and worthy goal that China is pursuing. America is lucky to already have it. America just needs better infrastructure and connectivity between its cities so that people can more readily and attractively kind of make those moves. And I think that it's true that in the maps that I've produced, you've got several dozen leading mega cities around the world, maybe 40 or 50. And those are the places that are attracting the most talent, in industry and so on. And people do need to make sure that they are, if they're not living in those cities, they need to be connected to them in some way in order to be a remote worker or to telecommute or to be able to kind of access services and employment or whatever the case may be in those cities. So what I say about Detroit in the book, is that you need to think of it as a halfway point on a Toronto, Chicago kind of corridor, right? Because Toronto and Chicago are two rich, powerful, connected, wealthy cities, and Detroit lies kind of halfway between them. The problem is Detroit's not very well connected, and you have this effort that's been going on for the last couple of years, this saga, actually you should call it, of trying to build a second bridge connecting Windsor and Detroit, and the U.S. can't come up with the paltry amount of money to fund its side of it. So the Canadian government said, okay, we'll build the whole thing. Just build a toll plaza on your side, please, for a whopping, only $200 million. Even that hasn't gotten done. And so we are actually choking off our own people who don't live in connected areas by not building them the connectivity that they need. And I point in my book to many pockets of America, not just Detroit, where if you just had better connectivity, parts of Ohio, parts of the Midwest, entire industries would benefit and flourish, and people could actually get to stay where they want to be because they would be efficiently connected to the markets of those city kind of hubs that they are close enough to benefit from economically. But you cannot benefit from the economy without the connectivity.
Hopefully at a second conversation, we can talk about this, but I would love to talk about the Iron Silk Road and what China is doing with rail. It's just, trains are absolutely amazing, and high-speed rail is absolutely amazing. The connectivity that offers, and I wish my home country had some of it. But look, one day, if someone out there listening has a little spare time, take the nonstop flight to Tokyo and go tour around Japan on some of those high-speed trains, and then go back home and say to yourself, "What in blazes are we not doing this? Why are we not doing this?" So we'll have to have that second conversation. But I would love to talk about how rail is expanding across the country. There's some massive, crazy, ambitious plans underway.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That is, well, it's if nothing else, there's not only long sections about that in the book, but also maps of what those routes should be in the book, both for the United States and actually for the entire Eurasian megacontinent. I've mapped them all out.
Yeah, it's amazing. Where is the best place we can send people to?
paragkhanna.com/connectography, or just Amazon, or wherever they want to, whatever their preferred place is to get books.
Connectography, mapping the future of global civilization. I appreciate you coming on today. We could talk forever. I could keep asking you questions, right? You can already tell that. I'm not going to stop, so you can't talk to me all day. But
come down to Singapore and we'll continue. We'll just flip on a tape recorder and carry on.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.